Hi, guys. So today we're going to be talking about Edmund Kemper, and he's known as co-ed butcher. So on August 27, 1964, 15-year-old Edmund Kemper was with his paternal grandparents on their 17-acre ranch in North Fork, California. He had gone there during the previous Christmas holidays, remaining for the rest of the school year before returning to his mother, and now was back. So his mom and his dad split up, and he was living with his mom, but he was like really giving her a lot of problems. And so one day he decided to run away, and he ran away to live with his dad. He was unfortunately the dad. He was not happy to see him because he was trying to start a new family. He even had a new baby, and so he was not at the least interested of Edmund Kemper. So he went back to his mom, and the mom was also trying to get married and start a new family. And so he was like a bad trouble kid, so they didn't want to do anything with him. So the mom decided to send Edmund to live with his grandparents, the parents of the dad. And so this was a on and off thing of him living with his grandparents. He wasn't happy about that. Already 6'4", so really tall and socially awkward, he was an intimidating figure, and people tended to shun him from one place to another. He'd grown frustrated and angry, later described himself as walking time bomb. If only someone had known then how to diffuse his rage. Instead, people around him seemed to ensure that it would grow worse. So he was really awkward, a 15-year-old kid. Like, if they don't like you at home, like, imagine his parents didn't like him. They basically were like, no, we don't, just get out of our life. We want to start a new life. Just, you're weird. You're too tall. You're just a weird kid. We don't want you. So he's not wanted from his parents. And at school, I'm pretty sure he's like awkward, ninth grade. 15-year-olds go to ninth grade, right? That's your awkward years. Like, people, poor kid, like, at home, usually if you have a bad home life at school, it's sometimes happy, but he wasn't having no happy anywhere. So Kemper disliked how his mother treated him, and his grandmother just was as bad. They were always pushing him around and telling him what to do. According to his own statement, he harbored fantasies of killing and mutilating them, and not just them. As a child, writes physics psychiatrist Donald Lude in Murder and Madness, so they wrote a book about him. Kemper wished that everyone else in the world would die, and he envisioned killing many of them himself. He had been he had also indulged in tormenting cats. He had buried one alive, then dug it up and cut off his head and stuck it on the head of a stick. So I believe he liked to murder cats because one time his mom found one in the closet. He had said that when he killed the family cat, placing its head on the altar, he had felt empowered. After persuasively lying about it, he honed his ability to persuade a public facade that people trusted him, while privately the world contained much dark areas. Evernet indicates that by the time he was 10, he had already thinking about female sexual terms. He was also developing a violent and inner world. So at 10 years old, he was already thinking about adult things. And also, most serial killers, if you notice, that they start showing signs very young, like they start to kill little animals, defensive animals, and that's a telltale sign. So if you're out there, you see like a little kid killing things, and then they seem to get pleasure from it, I would keep an eye on that person, or maybe help them out. They need help, maybe. That August afternoon, he argued in the kitchen with his 60-year-old grandmother, Maud Lunde, who interviewed him a length years later, said that he had displaced his anger at his mother onto Maud, his grandma. So it did not take much to make him react. Enraged, Kemper grabbed a rifle, and when she warned him not to shoot the birds, he turned and shot her instead. So she was scared of the birds. And then he's like he was so pissed, like whenever you're so mad in those rages of fit, like you're not really thinking straight, right? So he was like gonna kill a bird, but then he decided to shoot his grandma. He hit her in the head, writes Margaret Cheney in Why, the serial killer in America, another book about him, killing her, and then shot her twice in the back. So once in the head, twice in the back. Lunde says that he also stabbed her repeatedly with the kitchen knife, and David K. Fresher writes in the murder cases of the 20th century that it is 3 times in the back. So his first killing. So this was the first time, other than the cat, that he felt like, like with power after killing his poor grandma, 60 years old. Imagine a 6'5" guy killing his poor little grandma. So a shot to the head, two to the back, and then the knife. Like he was mad. So his first killing, if this account is correct, was impulsive, more than thoughtless act and a planned predatory intent. But then he had to do something to hide it from his grandfather. He was a big kid for his age, and the product of a 6 foot mother and a father that was 6'8". So his parents were really tall. So he did not have the much difficulty dragging his grandmother's corpse into the bedroom. So he tried to hide it from his grandpa. But then his grandfather was also named Edmund, drove up. The man was 72, and it was he who had given the boy the .22 caliber rifle the previous Christmas. So he gave him the gun that killed his wife. Young Edmund heard his car outside. So when you're home alone, I can tell when my wife gets here whenever like I hear her car pulled up right to the driveway. He went to the window and made the decision to finish the job he'd began. As the elderly man got out of his car, Kemper raised the rifle and shot him as well. Cheney says that he even hid the body in the garage. So the grandma in the bedroom, the grandpa in the garage. In his way, writes Lude, he had avenged the rejection of both his father and his mother. So he got all this anger out and he put it out into the universe, into his grandparents. Like he hated his mom, or he was mad at his mom and dad for not wanting him. And so he just pushed it on his grandparents and killed them. Not knowing what else to do, he called his mother in Montana and told her what he had done. Carmel urged him to call the police, and no doubt she was thinking of the dire warning that Cheney says she had given Edmund's biological father, whose parents were now dead. She told him not to be surprised if the boy killed them one day. The incomprehensible Edmund Kemper called the police and they came to the ranch to take him into custody. He was waiting calmly on the porch for them. They placed him on the California Youth Authority, and in an interview with the police later reported, he said he had shot his grandma to see what it felt like. That comment would be the quote most often associated with him. Used to show how cold-blooded he was at such a young age. Remember, he was 15 and he was like, I want to shoot her just to see how it feels. But then again, he was mad, so who knows? Yet another reading of it indicates that he wasn't merely stating the end result of his frustration with women. He explained that he killed his grandfather to spare him from having to find Maud dead, murdered by her grandson. So I guess he was really pissed at women, and so he decided to kill his grandma. And he killed his grandma just so his grandpa. So he killed the grandpa just so his grandpa won't be sad for finding his wife, right? I mean, he kind of he's thinking like he has a brain. He feels remorse for the grandpa, but also wanted to see how it felt killing. At the time, it seemed incomprehensible to the California system that a child could do such a thing. He was sent to for psychiatrist testing and diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia. He was also found to have a near genius IQ. Instead of staying at the facility operated by the youth authority, he ended up at the Secute Atascaro State Hospital for the criminally insane. And he was so intelligent and astute that he was allowed access to some of the assessment devices, even to administer them at times. According to John Douglas and Martha, Fraser says that while in the hospital, Kemper actually memorized the responses to 28 different assessment instruments, providing himself with the proper tools to convince those doctors who evaluated him that he would be safe to be released upon his 21st birthday. With his mother's help, he achieved this. So he was a pretty smart guy. Like the IQ test is for they test anybody. Like you want to see how smart you are, you take that test. And he was a genius, but he also had that disease, right? Um, Paranoid schizophrenia, and that messes with your brain. So being smart but having a mental disability, it's tough. But in those 6 years, because he got there when he was 15 and he was released when he was 21, in those 6 years he was able to learn a lot of the tools they use in the there, which is pretty cool. So he was a pretty smart guy. The most comprehensive sources of Kemper's case come from people who wrote during the 1970s. Immediately after his trial, including psychiatrists Donald Lude and authors Ward Damiel and Margaret Cheney, who had access to transcripts of what he called his compulsive confessings, Kemper also did an interview in 1978, which ended up in the Court TV's Mugshots program. Others included former FBI profilers Robert R. Douglas, who interviewed him at the length to discuss their encounters with him in their respective books. So, if you look at these interviews, they're all online. You can find them relatively easily, and they're interesting to see how he talked, his thinking, and you can actually hear his voice. Like, and a lot of people were interested on this guy during that time, right? While self-report is generally suspected that Kemper has to say about himself and his background is revealing, amounts of him generally emphasize his huge size, 6'9". So he grew how much? Like 8 inches. So he was 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds, but the manner in which he thinks and speaks is more interesting. Kemper's string of crimes was the third of San Jose, California since 1970. So it's instructive to look at the first two briefly to understand the climate of fear that hovered the area upon his arrest. So around the time he started to commit his murders. After his two grandparents, he committed lots of murders. But in that area where he was committing the murders, there was already people murdering people. Just after he came out of Atascero, the town that would become his new home, national headlines. So, death capital of the world. That's what they call this place during the 1970s. The beach town of Santa Cruz lies south of San Francisco on the Pacific coast, surrounded by mountains, oceans, and towering redwood trees. It's a tourist mecca, and it's an upscale place to own a home or rent an apartment. During the early 1970s, when the murders began, townspeople were already torn over the hippies moving in, thanks in part to the University of California opening a new campus there. Young people flooded in, and not all of them were that residents called desirable. So lots of hippies, like during that time they were like the peace era, they were like to do lots of drugs, kind of lazy. So that new college brought all these new people in. At the time, Damian writes, 95% of the murderers that occurred in America were primarily situational, inspired by domestic incidents or the result of some kind of altercation among acquaintances. But the murders during the 1970s in Santa Cruz defied this pattern, and while one killer was quickly captured after his crime, for several months no arrests were made or suspects identified for other cases. By 1973, people were purchasing guns to protect themselves because clearly these offenders were boldly entering the homes of ordinary citizens. So lots of people were buying guns because they wanted to protect their homes. Like, it's that we have that amendment, right? The right to bear arms. So people were going to the store. They're like, I need to protect my family. Near the end of the 1970s, so this is the first killer. John Lindsay Fraser murdered 5 people: the Alta family and Dr. Alta's secretary. To stop what he viewed as the spread of progress that was ruining the natural environment and extremists in the hippie lifestyle, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but nevertheless, he was found sane and convicted. So, this is the second person. Edmund was diagnosed with schizophrenia. This guy was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Is it during that time? Was it like, oh, like were they giving that diagnosis like candy out, or did they really have it? You know what I'm saying? Um, his trial became a circus, in part because he wanted to appear to be pretending to be insane, so the jury would believe he was malingering. So he wanted to look crazy because he didn't want people to kill him. But there was also an air of suspicion against hippies because over the span of 2 nights during the previous year, Charles Manson and his gang had massacred 7 people down in Los Angeles. Like Mason, Frazier had invaded a home and brutally killed the occupants, including 2 children, for some bizarre drug inspired vision. So here's the second guy. In the late 1972 and the early 73s, across a terrifying period of 4 months, another series of murders occurred around Santa Cruz. Among the victims were campers, a priest, a man digging in the garden, a young girl, and a mother and her 2 children. The police finally stopped the killer, Herbert Merlin, age 25. Although he had been instructionalized and evaluated as a danger to others, he nevertheless became an occupant, which allowed him to roam freely. He stopped taking his antipsychotic medication and heard a voice that urged him to kill. It was his mission, Mullen believed, to save the people of California from the super earthquakes that would send it into the ocean. So he was hearing voices, right? Thus, he decided that he had to sing the die of the song, which he believed would persuade 13 people to kill themselves or allow themselves to become human sacrifices, which he said they could fade to him telepathically. Using a knife, gun, or a baseball bat, he slayed those he selected. He killed until police picked him up. Also diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, so three people now, that killers schizophrenia. He nevertheless considered legally sane and was convicted on 10 counts of murder. But even before that, in May 1972, female hitchhikers began to disappear. To subdue public panic, the authorities tried to link these disappearances to Mullen, so they could assure the community that the spate of the murderers was at the end, but soon to turn out to be another person altogether, someone who surprised them. Eventually, Santa Cruz Centennial, the local newspaper, would put together a magazine that reviewed important events across the decade and featured those 3 killers. It felt like the act of the world gone crazy. Reporter Tom Hong. In 1970s was an age of violence, and along the Fraser and Mullen, they would add Edmund Kemper, now a young man. Altogether, the 3 killed 28 people and represented the 3 basic types of multiple murderers. Frazier killed all his victims at once, Mullen in a spree, accounting to his projection of goal of 13, and Kemper, he was 3 shy of 13. Remember, he killed 10. And Kemper as a serial killer. So remember, in the 1970s, there wasn't that much technology. There wasn't that many cars. So this is a life they were living at. That's why there was hitchhikers. So here's the early life. Kemper's crimes began before Mullen and stopped after him. What precipitated it, according to his accounts in several interviews, was his mother's constant needling and humiliation. When released by the parole board from Atascadero in 1969, the psychiatrist had advised that Kemper not to be to return to Clarnell because it could be trigger for more violence. But it appeared that no one was keeping watch. Having no means of support and no assistance from the youth authority, Kemper did move into Carnell, and according to him, she shook a berating him again. So his mom was always nagging him, always on his butt, like annoying him. And like this, he's a 21-year-old guy. And remember, you have to also think of hormones. So like when you're 15, you have a lot of hormones, and mixing that with anger and mixing that with rage, like and his mental, right? So all these three things, that's not good. Like all those three chemicals in your body, like that would um cause shock. And the fourth thing, the mom is over here pushing his buttons. Having left, I mean, I'm not excusing him for any means, but I'm just saying all these things are a big factor in what he did. Having left his third Having left her third husband, she had taken a job at the new university in Santa Cruz as an administrative assistant and moved into a duplex on Orford Drive. So the mom. They had frequent arguments that the neighbors overheard. Whether or not Carmel was a primary influence in his subsequent actions, there is no doubt that they had unrelentingly toxic relationship. As part of his parole requirements, Kemper went to community college and did well, but he hoped to get into the police academy one day. When he learned that he was too tall, so there was a height limit to get into the police academy, his consolidation was to hang out in the jury room where the police gathered to listen to their stories. They knew him as Big Ed and generally thought of him as a polite young man. His voice was soft and was manner polite, and his speech was intelligent and articulate. Remember, he had genius IQ. He had an IQ genius, right? Or a genius IQ. He idolized John Wayne, and everyone knew it. Little did they know that they would eventually be telling one of the most bizarre tales about him. He got several different jobs and finally ended up with California's Highway Department. When he had saved enough money to move out of his mother's home, he went to North Amelia near San Francisco and shared an apartment with a friend. But he often had no money and sometimes ended up back in Carnell. He purchased a motorcycle but got into two separate accidents, one of which Tamino says paid out a settlement and gave him $15,000. With this, he bought a yellow Ford Galaxy and began to cruise the area. He noticed young females out hitchhiking, the popular mode of travel for college students in those days. Remember, they don't have a lot of cars back then, and it was hard to buy one. And when he looked them over, as he described in later interviews, he thought about things he could do to them. Quietly, he prepared his car for what he had in mind, placing plastic bags, knife, and a blanket and handcuffs that he had acquired into the trunk. He only had to await the opportunity. For a period of time, he picked up girls and let them go. I guess he was practicing. By his estimation, he picked up around 150 hitchhikers, any of whom might have been chosen for his plan. Finally, he felt urgent inner drive, that what he called his little saplies, and he acted. Frightening Times of Edmund Kemper. So this is one of his first co-ed murders, right? On May 7th, 1972, as people were still troubled by the conclusion of Fraser trials less than 6 months before, Anne-Marie Precise and Anita Lucesia hitchhiked from Fresno College to meet friends at Stanford University. Damian Newton and Fraser laid out the events chronologically. When the girls failed to arrive at their destination, their families contacted the police, but runaways were all too frequent during those days, and these girls had left behind no clues of where they had gone, so they had little to the authorities could do. Then on August 15th, the remains of the female were recovered from an area in the mountains identified as Bekse. No other remains were found, but it was assumed that both girls had met the foul play and were dead. On September 14th, dance student Aiko Ko disappeared while hitchhiking from Beckley. On October 13th, Mullen's series of murders began to catch people's attention. But then, in 1973, 18-year-old Cindy Shaw disappeared while traveling to class at Cumbria Community College. She was hitchhiking and had stopped off to a friend's house. Someone saw her to get a ride, and she was just gone. Less than 2 days later, dismembered arms and legs were found in the cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Then an upper torso washed ashore, which was identified as via lung x-rays as Shaw's. Eventually, the lower torso came in. A surfer also found her left leg. Then on January 25, two local families were shot to death in their homes. Santa Cruz area was in a panic, and soon four young men were camping were all shot at close range on the head. Two more girls out hitchhiking disappeared on February 5th. Then on February 13th, the witness called the police after another shooting of a man in his garden. In short order, they were arrested Herbert Mullen. He was tied to most of the shootings, but not the murder of Cindy Shaw. So they thought people were reporting that it might have been a cult. So they found the remains, a skull and two jaws on March 4th. A couple of hitchhikers found them. Edmund Kemper makes a call on April 23rd, 1973. The Sanka police could receive the call that were not going to believe. So remember, he was friends with these cops. So he called and he's like, hey, I killed two people. And they were like, yo, you're just playing around, and they hanged up. And he called again and he was like, no, I really did kill people. I killed my mom and this person, and I'm a killer. Come get me. And they were like, no, you're just playing with it. Like, stop it, man. And so he called a third time, and this guy finally believed him a little bit. And so he went to check out the place where his mom and the mom's roommate or friend was, and they found them dead. And then that's when they believed him. They're like, oh, this is real. He's really killed people. So they went to arrest him, and he had when they found the both bodies stuffed in the closet, that's when they went to finally arrest him. Kemper explained that after leaving the house, he had driven to several days, had dropped off the car rented Green Show Impala, and finally decided to turn himself in. He had been taking no dolls for 3 days and felt half crazy. He listened half a dozen other murders that had yet to solve, so he told them about the other murders. He wanted someone to come pick him up. So remember, he was hanging out in the courthouse and he was getting tips on how to do his, like, how to kind of hide, how to get away from the cops, right? So DA Peter Chang and a party of detectives traveled across three states to pick up Kemper up from detention, where local police had placed him, and they found him waiting calmly again. So remember, the first time the cops picked him up from his grandparents' house, he was calm. He seemed to know what he was. He was dangerous and unable to control himself, and understood that he needed to be locked up. He was willing to talk and twice waived his rights for an attorney, though he would later say that he'd asked for a lawyer. The story unfolded was as bizarre as they had ever heard. He went on for hours, confessing everything he had ever done to the six co-eds, his mother and her friend, adding these to the murders of his grandparents years earlier. He had committed 10 murders in all. To prove his tale, he took detectives to the area where he had buried or tossed parts of his victims that had not yet been found. He described having sex with the heads of his victims and said that he loved the feeling of total possessing them and their property. These stories would grow worse during the trial. Thanks to the physical probing, both sides set about finding out what they could do about this disturbing young man. So that is a story of Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. And co-ed is, remember, he's killing college girls. So that's why co-ed. So thanks for listening. Subscribe and leave a comment if you liked it.